In August 1998, the Morrison family packed their car for what should have been a perfect week-long camping trip to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. That was the last time anyone saw the Morrison family alive. 20 years later, a land surveyor using a drone to map remote forest land in eastern Kentucky made a discovery that would change everything. Deep in the woods, hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, was a massive sinkhole, and at the bottom, a chaotic graveyard of hundreds of rusted, mangled cars stacked like broken toys, including the Morrison family car that had been missing for 2 decades. What investigators found in that hidden automotive cemetery would expose a conspiracy so vast and cold-blooded it had been operating in plain sight for over 20 years, turning family road trips into profitable murder schemes. Jake Morrison was 34 now, living in the same Columbus house where he'd grown up, the same front porch where he'd watched his family drive away on that August morning in 1998. 20 years of birthdays alone, 20 years of Christmas mornings with no one to call. He'd been 14 then, homesick with the flu while his parents and 2 sisters headed off for their annual camping trip. His dad had honked twice as they pulled out of the driveway, their family tradition. His mom had blown him a kiss. Sarah had yelled, "Feel better, loser," through her rolled-down window, while Jenny just waved, already lost in her Walkman. He was supposed to go with them, but the flu had kept him home with a fever of 102 and a cough that wouldn't quit. Now Jake spent his days installing drywall and replacing rotted window frames, carrying on the family construction business from the same garage where Dad used to store his tools. Morrison Construction. The magnetic sign on his work truck was faded, but legible. He was mudding seams in the Patterson kitchen when his phone rang. His hands were chalky with joint compound, and the homeowner had been hovering all morning, pointing out every imperfection. Unknown number. Kentucky area code. "Jake Morrison," he said, balancing the phone between his shoulder and ear. "This is Officer Beth Coleman with Kentucky State Police. I'm calling about your family." Jake's stomach dropped. After 20 years, those words still hit like a punch to the gut. He set down his putty knife and stepped outside onto the client's porch. The Patterson woman could wait. "What about them?" he asked, voice careful and flat. "We may have found their vehicle." Jake sat down hard on the porch steps. His legs just gave out. "Where?" His voice cracked like he was 14 again. Officer Coleman's tone was gentle but professional. A land surveyor named Dale Rivers was using a drone to map some remote forest land about 60 miles east of Mammoth Cave. He discovered what appears to be a large sinkhole filled with vehicles. Dozens of them, maybe more. They've been there a long time. Jake's throat went dry. "And you think?" "We spotted what looks like a yellow sedan matching the description of your family's 1996 Honda Accord. License plates too corroded to read from the drone footage, but the make, model, and color are consistent." Jake closed his eyes. Dad had been so proud of that car. "Barely used," he'd said when they bought it from Brennan's Auto Sales. "Rick Brennan knows good cars. This'll last us 20 years. 20 years. "You still there?" Coleman asked. "Yeah." Jake rubbed his face with his free hand. "Yeah, I'm here. We're going to need you to come down and take a look. I know this is difficult, but we need a family member to help with identification. You're listed as next of kin in the original missing persons file." Next of kin. Christ, he hated that phrase, made it sound so official, so final, like they'd all been reduced to paperwork and case numbers. "When?" he asked. "As soon as you can manage. Detective Amanda Cross is driving down from Louisville to take lead on this. She specializes in cold cases. She'll want to speak with you." Jake looked back through the screen door at the half-finished kitchen. The drywall compound was probably already starting to set. He'd have to scrape it off and start over. "I can be there tonight," he said. "Are you sure?" "I know this is a shock. You might want to—" "I've been waiting 20 years for this call," Jake said. "I'll be there tonight." Coleman gave him an address for the Kentucky State Police post in Bowling Green. She said Detective Cross would meet him there at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, then they'd drive out to the site together. After he hung up, Jake sat on the porch for a long time, staring at his work truck parked in the driveway. The same type of white Ford his father had driven back when Morrison Construction was more than just one man with a toolbox and a dream of keeping busy enough not to think. He called the Patterson woman and explained he had a family emergency and would finish her kitchen when he got back. She wasn't happy, but Jake didn't care. Some things were more important than crooked seams and customer satisfaction. The drive to Bowling Green took 4 hours. Jake made it in 3.5, stopping only once for gas and black coffee that tasted like motor oil. He checked into a motel that smelled like cigarettes and industrial carpet cleaner, but he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the scratchy bedspread and pulled out his phone. In his Photos app, buried in a folder he rarely opened, were the pictures. Mom and Dad on their wedding day, both of them so young and bright-eyed. Sarah in her homecoming dress, complaining that Jake was embarrassing her by taking pictures. Jenny missing her 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera while she held up a drawing of their family. 5 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a crooked chimney. The last photo was from the morning they left. Dad loading the cooler into the trunk, Mom checking her purse for the 3rd time, making sure she had the campground reservation. Sarah and Jenny arguing about who got to sit by the window. Jake stared at that last photo until his eyes burned. In the background, barely visible through the kitchen window, you could see him lying on the couch with a thermometer in his mouth and a box of tissues on his chest. He'd been so mad about missing the trip. Now he wondered if staying home had saved his life or ruined it. At 8:30 the next morning, he was already sitting in the parking lot of the Kentucky State Police Post, watching officers come and go through the glass doors. His hands shook as he drank gas station coffee that was somehow even worse than yesterday's. At exactly 9 a.m., a woman in a gray blazer and dark jeans walked out of the building and headed straight for his truck. She had short brown hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen too much but still cared anyway. Jake rolled down his window. "Jake Morrison?" she asked. He nodded. "Detective Amanda Cross, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." She had a firm handshake and a voice that managed to be both professional and kind. Jake liked her immediately. "Officer Coleman said you specialize in cold cases," he said. 23 years on the force. The last 8 focused exclusively on cases like yours." She glanced at the folder in her other hand. "Families who deserve answers, even if they're not the answers we want to hear." Jake got out of his truck and followed her to an unmarked sedan. The morning air was crisp and clean, nothing like the humid summer heat he remembered from 20 years ago. "Before we head out to the site," Detective Cross said as they buckled their seatbelts, "I want you to know what we're walking into. This isn't just a car accident, Jake. What Dale Rivers found? It's something else entirely." Jake's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "The sinkhole is massive, maybe 60 feet across, 40 feet deep, and it's full of cars, not just your family's vehicle, dozens of them, maybe more, all different makes and models, all appearing to be from the 1990s and early 2000s. They've been arranged deliberately, stacked and positioned to maximize space." Jake stared at her. "Arranged? By who?" "That's what we're going to find out." Detective Cross started the engine. "Someone's been using this location as a dumping ground for a very long time, and your family's car is just one piece of a much larger puzzle." As they drove through the winding Kentucky hills toward the remote forest where Dale Rivers had made his discovery, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too dangerous. But for the first time since that August morning in 1998, he felt like he might finally get some answers, even if they weren't the answers he wanted to hear. The forest road was barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through dense Kentucky woodland. Detective Cross's sedan bounced over ruts and exposed roots as they drove deeper into terrain that looked like it hadn't seen human traffic in decades. "How did Dale Rivers even find this place?" Jake asked, gripping the door handle as they hit another pothole. "Pure chance," Cross said, navigating around a fallen branch. He was doing a land survey for a logging company. They wanted to map the timber value before making an offer. His drone was doing a grid pattern when it picked up the anomaly. Jake stared out the passenger window at the thick canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in scattered patches, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that made everything look dreamlike and unreal. "How far back does this road go?" "About another mile. Then we walk." They drove in silence for several minutes. Jake's palms were sweating despite the cool morning air coming through the vents. 20 years of wondering, and he was finally going to see where his family's story ended, or maybe where it really began. The sedan rounded a bend, and Jake saw vehicles ahead, several Kentucky State Police cruisers, a forensics van, and a battered pickup truck that probably belonged to Dale Rivers. Crime scene tape stretched between trees, creating a perimeter around what looked like a natural clearing. Cross parked behind the forensics van and turned off the engine. "Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What you're about to see, it's going to be overwhelming. We're talking about hundreds of vehicles spanning more than 2 decades. Some are so rusted and deteriorated they're barely recognizable." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. "If you need to stop at any point, if you need to step back, just say so. There's no shame in that." They got out of the sedan, and Cross led him toward a cluster of officers standing near the edge of the clearing. Jake could hear voices, the crackle of police radios, the distant hum of generators powering forensics equipment. But what he heard most clearly was his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears like a drum. A tall man in coveralls and a baseball cap approached them. He had the weathered look of someone who spent his days outdoors, and his hands were stained with dirt. "You must be the family member," he said to Jake. "Dale Rivers. I'm real sorry about this whole situation." Jake shook his hand. "You found them." Rivers nodded, his expression grim. "Been doing land surveys for 15 years. Never seen anything like what's down in that hole?" Cross gestured toward the tree line. "Show us." They walked through the forest for about 200 yards, following a path marked with orange spray paint on tree trunks. The sound of the generators grew louder, and Jake began to smell something chemical, probably from whatever preservatives the forensics team was using. Then they crested a small ridge, and Jake saw it. The sinkhole was enormous, a gaping wound in the earth that looked like it had been carved by some massive hand. Portable floodlights had been set up around the perimeter, illuminating the depths below. And in those depths, like some twisted metal garden, were the cars. Dozens of them, maybe more, stacked and layered and wedged into every available space. Sedans and pickup trucks and minivans, all reduced to rust-eaten skeletons. Some were so deteriorated that only their basic shapes remained. Others looked like they'd been down there for just a few years. Jake's knees went weak. He grabbed onto a nearby tree for support. "Jesus," he whispered. "The yellow Honda is in the far corner," Cross said softly, "about halfway down. Do you want to get closer?" Jake forced himself to nod. They walked along the edge of the sinkhole until Cross stopped and pointed. There it was. Even after 20 years, even covered in rust and decay, Jake recognized it immediately. The distinctive shape of the rear window, the slight dent in the passenger door that Dad had gotten from a shopping cart at the grocery store, the roof rack that was supposed to hold their camping gear, his family's car buried in a tomb of twisted metal. "That's it," Jake said. His voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else. "That's their car." Cross made a note in her pad. "We'll need you to make a formal identification once we can get it extracted, but this helps confirm it." Jake stared down into the sinkhole, trying to process what he was seeing. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on what we can see from up here, the oldest vehicles look like they're from the early 1990s. The newest appear to be from around 2005 or 2006. 15 years, Jake said. Someone was dumping cars here for 15 years. Dale Rivers stepped up beside them. That's not even the strangest part. You see how they're arranged down there? That's not random. Someone took time to position them to maximize the space. This wasn't just a dumping ground. This was organized. Jake looked more carefully at the pattern below. Rivers was right. The cars weren't just thrown into the hole haphazardly. They'd been carefully stacked and positioned, smaller vehicles tucked into gaps between larger ones. It looked almost like a three-dimensional puzzle. "Who would do something like this?" Jake asked. "Someone with access to heavy equipment," Cross said, "and someone who knew this location wouldn't be disturbed. This is private land, owned by a timber company based out of Nashville. They haven't logged this section in over 30 years. A forensics technician in white coveralls approached them. She was young, maybe early 30s, with short black hair pulled back under a cap. "Detective Cross?" "We've got something you need to see." Cross looked at Jake. "You okay to keep going?" Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure that was true. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. The technician led them to a different section of the sinkhole perimeter. She pointed down toward a cluster of vehicles near the bottom. "See that blue pickup truck?" she said. "The one with the white camper shell?" Jake followed her gaze and spotted it. "We ran the partial plate we could make out through the database. That truck was reported stolen from a campground near land between the lakes in 1999. The family who owned it, the Hendersons, they were never found." Cross's expression darkened. "Missing persons case?" "Filed in Tennessee. Parents and 2 kids. They were supposed to be camping for a week, never checked out, never came home. Their campsite was found abandoned. Food still on the picnic table, clothes still in the tent. But no trace of the family or their truck." Jake felt sick. "How many families are down there?" The technician consulted her tablet. "We've identified partial plates on 16 vehicles so far, cross-referencing with missing persons databases. At least 8 of them correspond to unsolved disappearances. All families, all from the late 1990s to mid-2000s. The magnitude of what they were looking at began to sink in. This wasn't just about his family. This was about dozens of families, all of whom had simply vanished without a trace. All of whom had ended up in this hidden graveyard in the Kentucky woods. "We need to get down there," Cross said. "I want to see that Honda up close." The descent into the sinkhole required rappelling equipment and harnesses. Jake watched from above as Cross and 2 forensics technicians lowered themselves into the pit, their headlamps creating pools of light that moved like fireflies among the rusted hulks. From his vantage point on the rim, Jake could see Cross making her way carefully through the maze of vehicles toward his family's car. She moved slowly, taking photographs, making notes, occasionally calling up updates to the team above. When she reached the yellow Honda, she spent nearly 20 minutes examining it from every angle. Jake watched her peer through the windows, walk around the perimeter, and finally call up to him. "Jake, I need you to see something. Can you come down?" The thought of going into that mechanical graveyard made Jake's stomach churn, but he'd come this far. He couldn't stop now. The forensics team fitted him with a harness and showed him how to use the rappelling device. The descent felt endless, lowering himself down through 20 years of secrets and lies until his boots touched the uneven floor of metal and rust. Up close, the sinkhole was even more disturbing. The cars loomed overhead like some twisted sculpture, casting strange shadows in the artificial light. The air smelled of rust and decay, and something else, something organic and rotten that Jake didn't want to identify. Cross was waiting for him beside the Honda. Her expression was grim. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the rear window of the car. Jake approached carefully, stepping over twisted metal and broken glass. When he got close enough to see what she was pointing at, his blood ran cold. Scratched into the glass, barely visible but definitely there, were letters. Crude, desperate markings that looked like they'd been made with something sharp, maybe a key or a piece of jewelry. They spelled out 2 words: "Help us." Jake staggered backward, his vision swimming. After 20 years of wondering what happened to his family, he finally had his answer. They hadn't died in an accident. They'd been taken, and they'd lived long enough to know it. Jake couldn't stop staring at those 2 words scratched into the glass. Help us. The letters were uneven, desperate, carved by someone who knew they were running out of time. "Who wrote this?" he asked, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Detective Cross played her flashlight across the rear window, illuminating every scratch mark. Hard to say for certain. Could have been any of them. The markings look fresh enough that they were probably made shortly before whatever happened to them happened. Jake pressed his palm against the cool metal of the car's trunk. Through the rust and decay, he could still make out the faded outline of a family sticker his mom had put there. 2 parents and 3 kids holding hands. She'd bought it at a rest stop somewhere, said it made the car look more friendly. Now it looked like a gravestone marker. "We need to get inside," Cross said. "Check the interior." The driver's door was partially crushed from the weight of the cars above, but it opened with a screech of protesting metal. Cross aimed her flashlight into the cabin while Jake peered over her shoulder. The front seats were still there, though the fabric had rotted, and rodents had made nests in the stuffing. The dashboard was intact but warped from moisture and time. And there, wedged between the passenger seat and the center console, was something that made Jake's heart stop. A small purple hair tie, the kind Jenny used to wear to keep her bangs out of her eyes. "That's hers," Jake said. His throat felt raw. "That's Jenny's." Cross carefully extracted the hair tie with a pair of tweezers and dropped it into an evidence bag. "We'll test it for DNA, but if you're certain—" "I'm certain." Jake remembered buying a pack of those exact hair ties at the drugstore because Jenny had lost hers at school and cried for an hour. She'd been so particular about her hair, always fussing with it in the mirror before they went anywhere. They moved to the back seat. More evidence of his family's presence, a crumpled juice box that Sarah had probably been drinking, a paperback book that looked like one of Mom's romance novels, and something that made Jake's chest tighten with grief. A small stuffed elephant, gray and worn from years of hugging. Jenny's comfort toy, the one she'd had since she was 3 and couldn't sleep without. She would never have left that behind willingly, Jake said. If they'd gotten out of the car on their own, she would have taken it with her. Cross bagged the elephant carefully. "What else can you tell me about your family's habits, their routines? Anything that might help us understand how they ended up here?" Jake thought back to that last morning, trying to remember every detail. Dad was methodical about everything. He would have mapped out their route, made sure they had enough gas, checked the weather forecast. He wasn't the type to take random detours or pick up hitchhikers. "What about their destination? You said they were going to Mammoth Cave." "Yeah, they had reservations at a campground, Green River Campground, I think. They went there every summer since I was little. Same campground, same campsite if they could get it. Dad said it was tradition." Cross made notes in her pad. So they knew the route well. Dad could have driven it blindfolded. We took the same roads every year. Jake paused, a memory surfacing. There was one place they always stopped, a gas station with a restaurant attached, about halfway there. Mom liked their pie. We'd stretch our legs, use the bathroom, maybe get snacks for the road. "Do you remember what it was called?" "Turner's Travel Stop, I think. It was right off Highway 31E. Had these old-fashioned gas pumps and a big sign with a cartoon truck driver." Cross looked up from her notes. "That's helpful. We can check if they made it that far. See if anyone remembers seeing them." A shout from above interrupted them. One of the forensics technicians was calling down into the sinkhole. "Detective Cross, we found something up here you need to see." They made the climb back to the surface, Jake's legs shaking from more than just the physical exertion. Everything about this place felt wrong, like a wound that had been festering in secret for 20 years. At the top, the technician led them to a spot about 50 yards from the sinkhole. He pointed to a section of forest floor that had been cleared of leaves and debris. "We were expanding our search perimeter when we found this," he said. Jake looked down and saw what appeared to be the remnants of a campsite, a fire ring made of stacked stones, partially buried under years of leaf litter, pieces of rusted metal that might have once been camping equipment, and something that made his blood run cold. A wooden cross, roughly made and weathered gray, stuck into the ground at an angle. No name on it, no dates, just a simple marker in the middle of nowhere. "How many?" Cross asked quietly. The technician gestured toward the surrounding forest. "We've found 6 so far, all arranged in a rough line, about 20 feet apart, like a cemetery." Jake stared at the crude grave markers, his mind reeling. 6 crosses, 6 families maybe. How many people had died in this forgotten corner of Kentucky? "We're going to need cadaver dogs," Cross said, "and a full archaeological team. This is bigger than we thought." As if summoned by her words, Jake's phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet forest, and he almost didn't answer. But the caller ID showed a local number, and something made him pick up. "Jake Morrison." "Jake? This is Carol." His aunt's voice was tight with anxiety. "I just heard on the news that they found your family's car. Is it true?" Jake looked around at the crime scene, the police cars, the technicians documenting what might be his family's final resting place. "Yeah, Aunt Carol, it's true." "Oh, honey," her voice broke. "After all these years, I can't believe—" "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm at the site, with the police. They're still processing everything." There was a long pause. Then Carol said something that made Jake's stomach drop. "You know, this is probably nothing, but I was going through some old papers yesterday, and I found something that's been bothering me. A receipt from that car dealer where your dad bought the Honda, Rick Brennan's place." Jake's attention sharpened. "What about it?" "Well, the receipt shows they bought the car on July 15th, but I could have sworn David told me they bought it in June. I remember because we were talking about vacation plans, and he said he wanted to take the new car on the camping trip." "Why does that matter?" "It probably doesn't. It's just, if they bought the car in July, that means they only had it for a few weeks before the trip. Seems like an odd time to take a brand new car on a long drive through the mountains." Jake felt something cold settling in his stomach. "Aunt Carol, I need to ask you something. Do you remember anything unusual about that summer? Anything different about Dad's behavior, or Mom's?" Another pause. "Actually, yes. Your father seemed worried about something in the weeks before the trip. I asked him about it once, and he said something about car trouble, but that didn't make sense if they just bought a new car." After Jake hung up, he walked back to where Detective Cross was coordinating with the forensics team. She looked up as he approached. "Everything okay?" "I don't think my family's disappearance was random," Jake said. "I think someone who knew them, someone they trusted, was involved." Cross raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" Jake told her about the conversation with his aunt, about the timing of the car purchase, and his father's strange behavior in the weeks before the trip. "You think the car dealer had something to do with this?" Cross asked. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out more about Rick Brennan and his business. Because if my dad was worried about something, and it involved the car, then maybe Brennan knew more about your family's travel plans than he should have," Cross finished. Jake nodded. He would have known when they bought the car, where they lived, probably even where they were planning to go. Car dealers always ask those kinds of questions. Cross pulled out her phone. "I'm going to have someone run a background check on Richard Brennan and his dealership. See what we can find." As she made the call, Jake stared back at the sinkhole. Somewhere down there, buried under tons of rusted metal, were the answers to 20 years of questions. But he was beginning to suspect that the real answers weren't in that hole at all. They were in the records and memories and secrets of people who were still alive. People who had been walking around free for 20 years while families like his were nothing more than scrap metal in a hidden grave. That was going to change. Starting now. By the time they got back to the Bowling Green police station, it was nearly 6 p.m. Jake's clothes smelled like rust and decay, and he couldn't get the image of those crude wooden crosses out of his head. 6 markers, 6 families who never made it home. Detective Cross led him to a small conference room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and institutional. She spread files across the table while Jake sat down heavily in a plastic chair. "Coffee?" she asked. Jake nodded. He needed something to do with his hands, something to warm the chill that had settled into his bones down in that sinkhole. While Cross went to get coffee, Jake stared at the files on the table. Missing persons reports, police photos, incident summaries. All the bureaucratic paperwork that represented real families, real lives that had been cut short. Cross returned with 2 cups of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. "Okay," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I heard back from my contact who ran the background check on Richard Brennan." Jake leaned forward. What did they find? Brennan's auto sales has been in business since 1987. Clean record, no complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, taxes paid on time. On the surface, everything looks legitimate. On the surface? Cross opened one of the files. But when you dig deeper, some interesting patterns emerge. Between 1995 and 2005, Brennan sold vehicles to at least 12 families who subsequently disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Jake felt his pulse quicken. 12 families? The Hendersons with the blue pickup truck we found in the sinkhole, the Martinez family who vanished on a trip to the Great Smoky Mountains in 2001, the Thompson family who were driving to Florida in 2003 and never arrived. Cross pulled out photographs as she spoke. All of them bought cars from Brennan within 6 months of their disappearances. Jake stared at the photos. Normal-looking families posing with their new vehicles, smiling for the camera outside Brennan's dealership. They looked so happy, so unaware of what was coming. "That can't be a coincidence," Jake said. "No, it can't. But here's the thing. Brennan's not working alone. A pattern like this, spanning 10 years, involving multiple states, that requires coordination, infrastructure, people in positions of authority who can make investigations go away." Cross opened another file. "I also looked into the original investigation of your family's disappearance. The lead detective was Sheriff Dale Hutchins. He retired in 2010, moved to Florida. But while he was in charge, his department had a remarkably high rate of unsolved missing persons cases." "How high?" "In a county that should see maybe 1 or 2 missing persons cases per year, Hutchins' department had 47 unsolved disappearances between 1995 and 2010, all involving families who were traveling through the area." Jake set down his coffee cup with a shaking hand. 47 families? "It gets worse. I pulled the insurance records for the vehicles we found in the sinkhole. Every single one of them had comprehensive coverage with generous payouts for total loss. And guess who processed most of those claims?" Jake waited, though he was starting to see the shape of what Cross was describing. "Hartwell Insurance Group, based out of Louisville. Their claims adjuster for this region was Margaret Pierce. She approved over $3 million in payouts for stolen or missing vehicles between 1995 and 2005. $3 million. Split 3 ways between Brennan, Hutchins, and Pierce. That's a pretty good motive for murder." Cross leaned back in her chair. "Here's how I think it worked. Brennan identifies targets, families with good insurance, people planning road trips through isolated areas. He shares their information with Hutchins, who has his deputies intercept them on remote roads." Jake felt sick. "And then what?" "Then the families disappear. The cars get dumped in the sinkhole. Pierce processes the insurance claims, and they all split the money. Clean, efficient, and profitable." "But why kill them? Why not just steal the cars?" Cross's expression was grim. "Because dead people don't file police reports. Families who never come home can't identify their attackers. It was safer to eliminate the witnesses." Jake stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was lit by sodium vapor lights that cast everything in sickly yellow. Normal people were driving home from work, picking up dinner, living their ordinary lives. Meanwhile, he was learning that his family had been murdered as part of a systematic scheme to steal insurance money. "There's something else," Cross said quietly. "Something you're not going to like." Jake turned around. "What?" "I called Turner's Travel Stop, the place where your family always stopped. Talked to the owner, a man named Bill Turner. He's been running that place since 1985, knows all the regular customers." "And?" "He remembers your family, said they stopped there every year on their way to Mammoth Cave. But here's the thing. In August 1998, they never made it to his restaurant." Jake felt the room spinning slightly. "What do you mean?" "Turner's is about 90 miles south of Columbus, right? If your family left home at normal time, they should have reached Turner's by early afternoon. But Turner says he never saw them that day, which means they were intercepted somewhere between Columbus and Turner's." Jake sank back into his chair. "They never even made it halfway to Mammoth Cave. There's a stretch of Highway 31E that runs through some pretty remote country, lots of places where a sheriff's deputy could pull someone over without being seen." Cross pulled out a map and spread it on the table. "If I had to guess, I'd say they were stopped somewhere around here." She pointed to a section of highway that cut through heavily forested hills. Jake stared at the map, imagining his family's last moments. His father pulling over when he saw the flashing lights, probably annoyed at the delay, but not worried. His mother checking her purse for the registration and insurance cards. Sarah rolling her eyes at the inconvenience. Jenny clutching her stuffed elephant and asking if they were in trouble, none of them knowing they were about to die. "I want to see Brennan," Jake said suddenly. Cross looked up from the map. "What?" "Rick Brennan. I want to talk to him, face to face." "Jake, I understand you're angry, but we can't just—" "He sold my family the car that got them killed. He probably gave Hutchins their home address, their travel plans, maybe even their route to the campground." Jake's voice was getting louder. "I want to look him in the eye and ask him why. Even if that's true, confronting him won't bring your family back, and it could compromise our investigation." Jake stood up again, pacing to the window and back. "So what? We just sit here and analyze files while he walks around free? It's been 20 years, Detective. 20 years of him sleeping in his own bed while my family rots in that sinkhole." Cross watched him pace for a moment, then said, "What if I told you that Brennan might not be sleeping so well these days?" Jake stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "Margaret Pierce, the insurance adjuster? She died in a car accident 3 years ago. Dale Hutchins had a heart attack last year. Brennan's the only one left who knows what really happened." "So?" "So maybe he's getting nervous. Maybe he's wondering when someone's going to connect the dots and come looking for him." Cross leaned forward. "And maybe, if we approach this right, we can use that nervousness to our advantage." Jake sat back down. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we pay Richard Brennan a visit, but we do it smart. We go in with a plan and we get him talking, because if he thinks he's about to go down for 47 murders, he might be willing to tell us where the bodies are buried." "You think he'll cooperate?" Cross smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I think he's going to be very surprised to learn that we found his automotive graveyard. And I think he's going to be even more surprised to learn that we've connected him to multiple missing families." She started gathering up the files. "But first, we need to coordinate with the FBI. A conspiracy this big, crossing state lines, involving federal insurance fraud. This is bigger than the Kentucky State Police can handle alone." "How long will that take?" "A day, maybe 2. I've already put in calls to the Louisville field office. They're sending down a team tomorrow morning." Jake nodded, though the thought of waiting even one more day made his skin crawl. After 20 years of not knowing, patience was a luxury he didn't have. "There is one thing you can do in the meantime," Cross said. "What's that?" "Go home, get some rest, and start thinking about what you want to say to the man who killed your family." Jake left the police station as the sun was setting behind the Kentucky hills. The drive back to Columbus felt endless, every mile taking him further from the answers he'd been seeking for 20 years. But for the first time since that August morning in 1998, he felt like he was finally getting close to the truth. And tomorrow he was going to start making people pay for what they'd done to his family. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, writing down everything he could remember about Rick Brennan. The man had been a fixture in their small Ohio community for as long as Jake could remember. Brennan's auto sales occupied a corner lot on Main Street, with a line of used cars gleaming under string lights and colorful plastic flags that snapped in the wind. Rick himself was the kind of guy who knew everyone's name, sponsored the Little League team, and always had a joke ready when you stopped by to browse. Jake remembered the day his dad bought the Honda. It was a Saturday in July, hot and humid, the kind of day when the asphalt felt soft under your feet. Dad had been talking about getting a more reliable car for months. The old Buick was burning oil and making concerning noises whenever they drove up hills. "Come on, son," Dad had said. "Let's go see what Rick's got on the lot." Jake had been 15 then, old enough to care about cars, but not old enough to drive. He'd wandered around the lot while Dad talked business, kicking tires and peering through windows at odometers and stereo systems. Rick Brennan had been all smiles and firm handshakes. "Dave Morrison," he'd called out when he saw them. "How's the family?" "Kids getting big, I bet." Dad had introduced Jake, and Rick had made the usual small talk about school and sports and plans for the summer. Then he'd steered them toward the yellow Honda. "This beauty just came in," Rick had said, patting the hood like it was a prize horse. "One owner, low miles, perfect for family trips. You folks still taking those camping vacations down to Kentucky?" At the time, Jake had thought nothing of the question. Rick knew everyone in town, knew their habits and routines. Of course, he'd remember their annual camping trips. Now, writing it all down in the harsh light of his kitchen, Jake realized Rick had been gathering intelligence. How many people were in the family, where they liked to travel, what routes they might take, information that would be very useful if you were planning to intercept them on a lonely road. Jake's phone rang at 6 a.m., jolting him out of his memories. Detective Cross. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked without preamble. "Not really? You?" "About 3 hours. Listen, the FBI team arrived early. Agent Torres wants to meet with you before we approach Brennan." "When?" "Now, if you can make it. We're at the Bowling Green station." Jake was already reaching for his truck keys. "I'll be there in 4 hours. Drive careful. And Jake, bring whatever you wrote down last night. I can hear it in your voice. You remembered something important." The FBI team consisted of 3 agents in dark suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a television show. Agent Frank Torres was the lead, a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of calm authority that came from decades of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. "I've reviewed Detective Cross's files," Torres said after introductions were made. "This appears to be a sophisticated operation involving multiple jurisdictions and federal crimes. Insurance fraud alone carries a 20-year sentence." "What about murder?" Jake asked. "If we can prove the murders were committed in furtherance of the fraud scheme, we're looking at federal death penalty cases." Torres opened a laptop and pulled up a satellite image. "But first, we need to establish the full scope of the operation." The image showed the sinkhole from above, with dozens of vehicles visible as dark shapes in the pit. Red markers indicated the location of each car that had been identified so far. "Preliminary estimates suggest there are over 60 vehicles down there," Torres continued. "If each vehicle represents a family of 3 to 5 people, we're looking at potentially 200 murder victims." Jake felt the number hit him like a physical blow. 200 people, mothers and fathers and children, all killed for insurance money. "The question is," Torres said, "how do we approach Brennan without spooking him? If he runs, or if he destroys evidence, we might never get justice for these families." Detective Cross leaned forward. "I think we use Jake." Torres raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Brennan sold Jake's family their car. He probably remembers them. If Jake shows up asking questions about the vehicle, acting like he's just trying to get closure. "You want me to pretend I don't know anything," Jake said. "Exactly. Go in as a grieving family member who's finally gotten a lead after 20 years. See what he says. See if he gives anything away." Torres nodded slowly. "It could work, but you'd have to be very careful. If Brennan suspects you know more than you're letting on." "I can handle it," Jake said. "I've been thinking about what I'd say to him for 20 years. They spent the next 2 hours planning the approach. Jake would wear a wire, a tiny transmitter that would broadcast everything Brennan said to a surveillance van parked nearby. Detective Cross and Agent Torres would be listening, ready to move in if things went wrong. The plan was simple. Jake would tell Brennan that the police had found his family's car and he was trying to piece together their last movements. He'd ask about the sale, about anything unusual Brennan might have noticed, about whether his parents had mentioned their travel plans. All questions a grieving son might naturally ask. All questions that might prompt Brennan to reveal more than he intended. Brennan's auto sales looked exactly the same as Jake remembered. The same string lights, the same plastic flags, the same lineup of used cars promising reliable transportation at affordable prices. Even the hand-painted sign was the same, though it had faded over the years. Jake parked his truck across the street and sat for a moment, watching the lot. A few customers browsed among the vehicles, kicking tires and checking price tags. A young salesman in a cheap suit was talking to a couple about a red sedan. And there, standing near the office door, was Rick Brennan. He was older now, grayer, with a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there 20 years ago. But his smile was the same as he talked to a potential customer, wide and genuine-looking, the smile of a man who'd built his living on being likable. Jake touched the small transmitter taped to his chest, took a deep breath, and got out of his truck. Brennan noticed him almost immediately. His eyes tracked Jake as he crossed the street, and Jake could see the moment of recognition, a slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of the shoulders. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan said as Jake approached. "Jake Morrison, you've grown up some since I last saw you." "Hi, Rick. It's been a while." "Must be, 15 years? 20? Brennan's smile never wavered, but Jake noticed his hands were clasped tightly behind his back. "What brings you by?" "Finally ready to buy your first car?" "Actually, I wanted to ask you about a car you sold my family, the yellow Honda, back in 1998. Something flickered across Brennan's face, so quickly that Jake almost missed it. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "The Honda," Brennan said slowly. "Yeah, I remember that sale. Your dad was a good man. Terrible thing. What happened to them?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. The police found the car." Brennan's smile faltered for just a moment. "Found it? Where?" "In a sinkhole about 60 miles from Mammoth Cave. It had been there for 20 years. Jake watched Brennan's face carefully. "They think it might help them figure out what happened to my family." "Well, that's good news, I suppose. I mean, not good, but closure, you know." Brennan was recovering his composure, but Jake could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Did they find your family?" "Still looking." "But I was hoping you might remember something about the sale. Anything my dad might have said about their trip or where they were planning to go." Brennan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Your dad was excited about that car, said it would be perfect for camping trips. Mentioned they were heading down to Kentucky, I think? Mammoth Cave?" "That's right. Did he say anything else? About the route they were taking, or when they were leaving?" "Oh, that was so long ago. I sell a lot of cars, you know. Hard to remember every conversation." Brennan glanced toward his office. "But I think he mentioned they always took the same route. Highway 31E, wasn't it? Said it was scenic." Jake's blood ran cold. Highway 31E was exactly where Detective Cross thought his family had been intercepted. and there was no way Brennan should remember that level of detail about a car sale from 20 years ago, unless it was important to him for reasons that had nothing to do with customer service. "Yeah, that sounds right," Jake said, keeping his voice casual. "Did anyone else know about their travel plans? Other customers, maybe? People my dad might have talked to while he was here?" Brennan's eyes darted toward the street, as if he was looking for something, or someone. "Can't say that I recall. Like I said, it was a long time ago." He forced another smile. "I'm sure the police will figure it all out now that they've found the car. Modern forensics, you know. Amazing what they can determine from evidence. I hope so. My family deserves justice." "Of course they do, of course." Brennan took a step toward his office. "Well, it was good seeing you, Jake. I hope you get the answers you're looking for." "Actually, there is one more thing," Jake said. "Do you have any records from that sale? Paperwork, maybe? The police asked me to see if I could track down any documentation." Brennan stopped walking. For several seconds he stood perfectly still, his back to Jake. When he turned around, his smile was gone. "You know, Jake," he said quietly, "sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Your family's been gone a long time. Maybe it's time to let them rest in peace." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means some questions are better left unasked. Some stones are better left unturned." Brennan's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "You understand what I'm saying?" Jake felt the wire against his chest, recording every word. In the surveillance van, Detective Cross and Agent Torres were hearing this too. "Are you threatening me, Rick?" Brennan's laugh was hollow. "Threatening? No, son. I'm giving you some friendly advice. The same advice I'd give any young man who's poking around in dangerous territory." He turned and walked toward his office, then paused at the door. "You have a nice life, Jake. A good business from what I hear. Be a shame if anything happened to disturb that peace you've built for yourself." Then he disappeared inside, leaving Jake standing alone among the used cars with their bright price tags and false promises. But Jake wasn't alone. In his earpiece, he heard Detective Cross's voice, calm and professional. "We got him," she said. "That was as good as a confession. Move away from the lot. We're coming in." Jake was halfway across the street when he heard the commotion behind him. Car doors slamming, voices shouting, the sharp crack of police radios coming to life. He turned to see FBI agents and Kentucky State Police surrounding Brennan's auto sales, their vehicles forming a loose perimeter around the lot. Through the office window, Jake could see Rick Brennan at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale, his free hand gesturing frantically as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. Agent Torres approached Jake, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good work in there. His reaction when you mentioned Highway 31E was particularly telling." "He remembered way too much about a 20-year-old car sale," Jake said, "and that threat at the end. Sealed the deal. We've got enough for a search warrant and probable cause for arrest." Torres glanced back toward the office. "Question is, what's he doing on that phone?" Detective Cross joined them, pulling off her headphones. "He's been on the line for 3 minutes. Could be calling a lawyer, could be warning someone." "Or destroying evidence," Torres said. He spoke into his radio. "All units, move in now. Secure the suspect and all communication devices." Jake watched as agents stormed into the office. Through the window he could see Brennan's panicked face as they surrounded his desk, one agent taking the phone from his hand while another placed him in handcuffs. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now we search everything," Torres said. "Business records, financial documents, computer files. If Brennan kept any evidence of the conspiracy, we'll find it. And if he didn't? Then we hope the wire recording is enough to get him talking. A man his age, facing federal murder charges, most people start cooperating pretty quickly." The search of Brennan's auto sales took 6 hours. Jake watched from across the street as FBI technicians carried out boxes of files, computer hard drives, and filing cabinets. They dismantled Brennan's office piece by piece, looking for hidden compartments or concealed documents. Detective Cross found Jake sitting in his truck around noon. "You should go get something to eat," she said. "This is going to take all day." "I'm not leaving," Jake said. "Not until I know what they found." Cross leaned against the truck's hood. "Can I ask you something? What are you going to do when this is over? When we've arrested everyone involved and closed the case?" Jake hadn't thought that far ahead. For 20 years, finding answers about his family had been the central purpose of his life. Without that driving need, what was left? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess I'll figure that out when the time comes." You know, there are other families out there, other people who've been waiting for answers just like you have. The Hendersons, the Yamamoto family, the Martinezes, they all have relatives who've never given up hope. Jake looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're good at this. You've got instincts, and you understand what it's like to lose everything. There are a lot of cold cases out there that could use someone who cares as much as you do." Before Jake could respond, Agent Torres emerged from the office building, carrying a laptop bag and looking pleased with himself. "We found something," he announced as he approached the truck. Brennan kept detailed records, not just of the car sales, but of the entire operation. Jake's pulse quickened. What kind of records? Torres set the laptop bag on the truck's hood and pulled out a manila folder. Customer profiles, travel itineraries, route maps, and what appears to be a payment ledger showing how the insurance money was distributed. He opened the folder and handed Jake a sheet of paper. It was a typed document with his family's information at the top: names, ages, address, and details about their 1996 Honda Accord. Below that was information that made Jake's blood run cold. Departure date, August 15, 1998. Destination, Green River Campground, Mammoth Cave National Park. Route, Highway 31. E south to Route 70 west. Estimated arrival at Turner's Travel Stop, 1:30 p.m. Intercept point, mile marker 127. Highway 31 E assets. Vehicle, camping equipment, approximately $800 cash. Insurance value, $45,000. Jake's hands shook as he read the document. They planned it all out, down to the exact mile marker where they were going to stop my family. "Gets worse," Torres said. He handed Jake another sheet. "This appears to be a post-operation report." The second document was shorter but more horrifying. It described the successful completion of the Morrison family operation, including details about the disposal of assets and evidence. It was written in the same cold, bureaucratic language you might use to describe a business transaction, which Jake realized was exactly what it had been to them. "There are 43 similar files," Torres continued, "covering operations from 1995 to 2005. Every missing family we've identified, plus dozens more we didn't know about." Detective Cross leaned over Jake's shoulder to read the documents. "This is a complete confession. Brennan documented everything." "Why would he keep records like this?" Jake asked. "Doesn't he understand how incriminating they are?" "Insurance fraud is complicated," Torres explained. "You need documentation to track payouts, coordinate timing, manage the financial side of the operation. Brennan probably thought these files were secure." "Plus," Cross added, "criminals are often stupider than they think they are. They get comfortable, they get sloppy, they keep trophies." Jake stared at the folder in his hands. 43 families. Hundreds of people who had been murdered for insurance money, their deaths reduced to profit margins and operational efficiency. "Where are the bodies?" he asked. Torres's expression darkened. "That's the one thing Brennan didn't document. The files show planning and financial records, but nothing about final disposal of remains." "So we still don't know where my family is buried?" "Not yet, but now we have leverage. Brennan's looking at federal murder charges that could put him on death row. That tends to make people very cooperative very quickly." An FBI agent approached them, holding a cell phone. "Agent Torres? Brennan's asking to speak with you. Says he wants to make a deal." Torres smiled grimly. "That was faster than I expected. Bring him to the interrogation room at the Bowling Green station and get his lawyer on the phone. He's going to need one." 2 hours later, Jake found himself sitting in an observation room watching Rick Brennan through a one-way mirror. The man who had seemed so confident and threatening just hours earlier now looked old and defeated. His hands shook as he sipped water from a plastic cup, and his eyes darted constantly around the interrogation room. His lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, sat beside him with a legal pad covered in notes. Agent Torres and Detective Cross sat across the table from them, a stack of files between them. "Let's start simple," Torres said. "How many families did you kill?" Brennan's lawyer leaned forward. "My client is prepared to cooperate fully in exchange for life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The death penalty is off the table." "That depends on what he tells us," Torres replied. "How many families, Richard?" Brennan cleared his throat. 43 families, 212 people total. Even though Jake had seen the files, hearing Brennan say the numbers out loud hit him like a punch to the gut. 212 people. Children, parents, grandparents, all murdered for money. "How did it work?" Cross asked. Brennan glanced at his lawyer, who nodded. "I identified the targets, families with good insurance, people planning trips through isolated areas. I'd pass their information to Dale Hutchins, and he'd arrange for them to be stopped on the road." "Stopped how?" "His deputies would pull them over, traffic violation, vehicle inspection, something routine. The families wouldn't be suspicious. It was just a normal police stop." "And then?" Brennan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then they'd be taken to a secondary location. Hutchins had a place in the woods, an old hunting cabin. That's where—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Where they were killed," Torres said flatly. Brennan nodded. "What happened to the bodies?" "Hutchins handled that part. I didn't want to know the details." "But you knew they were being murdered." "Yes." The word was barely audible. Cross leaned forward. "What about the insurance claims?" "How did that work?" "Margaret Pierce processed the claims. She'd wait a few weeks after each operation, then file reports claiming the vehicles had been stolen or the families had met with accidents in remote areas. The insurance companies paid out, and we split the money 3 ways." "How much money total?" Brennan consulted with his lawyer again before answering. "Approximately $8 million over 10 years. Jake felt sick. His family's lives had been worth about $180,000 to these people, less than the cost of a house. Torres pulled out a map and spread it on the table. "Where is Dale Hutchins's hunting cabin?" "About 20 miles northeast of the sinkhole, off an old logging road that's not on most maps." Brennan pointed to a spot on the map. "The cabin's probably collapsed by now, but the cellar, that's where he put them." Jake's hands clenched into fists. His family was in a cellar under a collapsed hunting cabin, buried like garbage after being murdered for insurance money. "We'll need exact coordinates," Torres said. "I can draw you a map, but you should know, Hutchins wasn't the only one. He had help, other deputies, maybe even some state police. This thing went deeper than just the 3 of us." Cross and Torres exchanged glances. "How much deeper?" "I don't know all the names. Hutchins kept that information to himself, but there were others. Had to be, to make this many people disappear without anyone asking questions." The interrogation continued for another hour, with Brennan providing details about specific operations, financial arrangements, and the logistics of the conspiracy. Jake listened to it all, taking mental notes, burning every detail into his memory. When it was over, Agent Torres joined Jake in the observation room. "We've got enough to put him away forever," Torres said. "And more importantly, we know where to look for the remains." "When do we go there?" "First light tomorrow. We'll bring cadaver dogs, forensic specialists, everything we need to properly recover and identify the remains." Jake stared through the one-way mirror at Rick Brennan, who was now hunched over the table with his head in his hands. "I want to be there," Jake said. "When you find them, I want to be there." Torres nodded. "I figured you would. Just be prepared. After 20 years in the ground, identification is going to be difficult. Mainly dental records and DNA. I understand, but they're my family. They've been alone out there for 20 years. The least I can do is be there when they come home." The convoy left Bowling Green at dawn. FBI vehicles, Kentucky State Police cruisers, a forensics van, and a truck carrying ground-penetrating radar equipment. Jake followed in his own truck, unwilling to be a passenger when they were finally going to bring his family home. The drive to Hutchins' hunting cabin took them deep into Daniel Boone National Forest, along increasingly narrow roads that eventually became little more than dirt tracks, winding through dense hardwood forest. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Agent Torres had wanted to leave Jake behind, arguing that a crime scene was no place for family members. But Detective Cross had intervened, pointing out that Jake had earned the right to be there through 20 years of searching and 2 days of helping them crack the case. "Just stay back and let us work," Torres had finally agreed. "This is going to be difficult enough without civilians getting in the way." They found the hunting cabin exactly where Brennan had indicated on his hand-drawn map. Or rather, they found what remained of it. 2 decades of neglect had reduced the structure to a few rotting wall studs and a collapsed roof covered in vines and moss. Only the stone foundation and chimney remained intact, poking up through the undergrowth like broken teeth. "There," said Dr. Sharon Kim, the FBI's forensic anthropologist. She pointed to a depression in the ground near what had once been the cabin's rear wall. "That looks like a cellar entrance." The depression was partially hidden by fallen logs and accumulated debris, but Jake could make out the outline of what might once have been a wooden door or hatch. His stomach clenched as he realized his family was probably buried just a few feet below where he was standing. The forensics team worked methodically, first using metal detectors to map the area for any buried objects, then bringing in the ground-penetrating radar to create a detailed picture of what lay beneath the surface. Dr. Kim studied the radar images on a laptop screen, her expression growing increasingly grim. "We've got multiple anomalies consistent with human remains," she announced. "Looks like there might be several burial sites around the cabin." "How many?" Detective Cross asked. "Hard to say from the surface scans. At least a dozen discrete areas of disturbance. Could be more." Jake watched the forensics team begin the painstaking process of excavation. They worked in a grid pattern, carefully removing layers of soil and debris, photographing and cataloging everything they found. It was slow, methodical work, the kind of patient scientific process that Jake's construction-trained mind could appreciate, even as his heart screamed for them to move faster. The first discovery came around noon. Dr. Kim called everyone over to a section of the grid about 10 feet from the collapsed cabin. "Textile fragments," she said, holding up a small evidence bag containing what looked like scraps of faded fabric. "Appears to be cotton, possibly from clothing. And this—" She held up another bag containing what looked like a small metal object. "Looks like a zipper pull, from a jacket or sweatshirt." Jake's breath caught. His mother had been wearing a blue windbreaker the morning they left. He remembered it clearly because she'd debated whether to pack it or wear it, finally deciding the mountain air might be cool even in August. "Can you tell how old it is?" he asked. Dr. Kim examined the zipper pull through the plastic bag. Metal corrosion is consistent with 20 years of burial, and the textile fragments show the right degree of decomposition for that time frame. They continued digging. More fabric, a few buttons, part of a leather wallet so degraded that any identification it might have contained had long since rotted away. And then, around 2 p.m., Dr. Kim made the discovery they'd all been dreading and hoping for. "I've got bone," she said quietly. Jake felt his knees go weak. After 20 years of wondering, of imagining, of hoping against hope that maybe his family had somehow survived, he was finally faced with the physical reality of their deaths. Detective Cross put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to watch this part," she said gently. "Yes, I do," Jake replied. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They're my family. I'm not leaving them alone again." Dr. Kim worked with infinite care, using small brushes and dental picks to slowly expose what she'd found. First a section of what appeared to be a rib cage, then part of a skull, then the unmistakable curve of a human spine. "Adult female," she announced after several minutes of examination, "based on the pelvic structure and skull measurements, 5'4" to 5'6" in height." Jake's mother had been 5 feet 5 inches. The excavation continued through the afternoon. More bones emerged from the soil, arms, legs, fingers. Dr. Kim laid them out on a tarp in anatomical order, slowly reconstructing the skeleton of someone who had been murdered 20 years ago and buried in this forgotten corner of the Kentucky forest. "Any obvious signs of trauma?" Agent Torres asked. Dr. Kim pointed to the back of the skull. "Depressed fracture here, consistent with blunt force trauma. Probably the cause of death." Jake turned away, bile rising in his throat. It was one thing to know intellectually that his family had been murdered. It was something else entirely to see the physical evidence of violence done to his mother's body. "We've got another site over here," called one of the other forensic technicians. She was working about 15 feet away, near what had once been the cabin's front porch. Jake forced himself to look as they began uncovering a second set of remains. These bones were smaller, more delicate. "Juvenile," Dr. Kim announced after a preliminary examination. "Approximately 12 to 14 years of age." "Jenny?" His little sister, who had hugged him tight and promised to bring back a cool rock from Mammoth Cave. By the end of the day, they had uncovered parts of 4 skeletons from the area immediately around the collapsed cabin. Adult male, adult female, and 2 juveniles, the right number and approximate ages to be Jake's family. But Dr. Kim cautioned against premature conclusions. "We'll need dental records and DNA analysis for positive identification, and we're far from finished here." The ground-penetrating radar showed disturbances across a much wider area. Jake sat on a fallen log as the forensics team packed up their equipment for the day. The bones that might be his family's remains were carefully boxed and labeled, ready for transport to the FBI laboratory in Louisville, where the identification process would continue. Detective Cross sat down beside him. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "For 20 years I've wondered what happened to them, whether they suffered, whether they knew what was happening. And now? Now I know they were murdered and thrown in a hole in the ground like they were nothing." Jake's voice was bitter. "At least when they were just missing, I could pretend they might have survived somehow, gone off to start new lives somewhere. Now I know the truth. The truth is that they were victims of evil people who cared more about money than human life," Cross said. "But it's also true that you never gave up on them. You spent 20 years searching, and you finally brought them home." Jake looked back toward the excavation site, where yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze. "This isn't home. This is just where they were murdered and buried." "Home is where people remember you and love you," Cross said. "Your family has been home with you all along. Everything else is just geography." They drove back to Bowling Green as darkness fell over the Kentucky hills. Jake followed the convoy's taillights along the winding forest roads, his mind cycling through 20 years of memories and regrets. At the police station, Agent Torres briefed him on what would happen next. The remains would be transported to the FBI lab for analysis. Dental records from the Morrison family's dentist had already been requested. DNA samples would be compared against a sample Jake had provided. "How long for results?" Jake asked. "Dental comparison should take a few days. DNA analysis could take several weeks, depending on the condition of the samples." "And then what?" Then we release the remains to you for burial, and we continue building our case against everyone involved in the conspiracy." Jake drove back to his motel that night with his family's possible remains riding in a government van somewhere ahead of him on the interstate. After 20 years of not knowing where they were, it felt strange to finally have a specific location for them, even if that location was a forensics laboratory. He called his Aunt Carol from the motel room. "They found them," he said when she answered. There was a long silence. Then, "Are you sure it's them?" "Not officially, but the location matches what the suspects told us, and the remains are consistent with our family. 4 people, right ages." Carol started crying. Jake could hear her trying to stifle the sobs, probably not wanting to make this harder for him than it already was. "I'm sorry," she said finally. I always hoped they might still be alive somewhere. It's stupid, I know, but—" "It's not stupid," Jake said. "I hoped the same thing." "What happens now?" "Now we wait for official identification. Then we can finally bury them properly." After he hung up, Jake sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared at his hands. They were dirty from the excavation site, with soil under his fingernails that might have once covered his family's graves. Tomorrow they would continue digging. They would find more families, more victims of Dale Hutchins and Rick Brennan and Margaret Pierce's money-making scheme. The investigation would continue, more arrests would be made, justice would slowly grind forward. But tonight, Jake Morrison was alone in a cheap motel room, finally knowing what had happened to his family and wishing he could go back to not knowing. Because sometimes the truth was more painful than the mystery had ever been. Jake's phone rang at 5:47 a.m., jolting him from the first real sleep he'd had in 3 days. Dr. Sharon Kim's voice was gentle but professional. "Jake? I wanted to call you personally with the results. The dental records are a match. It's your family." Jake sat up in the motel bed, the words hitting him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. 20 years of uncertainty ended with a single phone call. "All 4 of them?" he asked. "Yes, your parents and both sisters. I'm sorry for your loss." After he hung up, Jake sat in the dark room for a long time, staring at the thin line of light creeping under the curtains. It was strange how final confirmation could feel both like relief and devastation at the same time. His family was dead, officially, scientifically, undeniably dead. But at least now he knew. He was getting dressed when the phone rang again. Detective Cross. "I heard from Dr. Kim," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." It wasn't true, but it was the only answer he could manage. "There's something else you need to know. We found 12 more burial sites yesterday. The radar showed disturbances all through that section of forest." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. 12 more families? "We think so. This operation was bigger than even Brennan admitted. We're going to be digging for weeks." "What about the other suspects?" "Hutchins and Pierce." "Hutchins died last year, remember? Heart attack. But we're reopening investigations into everyone who worked under him. If there are other deputies involved, we'll find them." Jake finished dressing and checked out of the motel. The drive back to Columbus felt surreal. The same roads he'd traveled countless times, but everything was different now. He wasn't searching anymore. He wasn't wondering. He was just a man driving home after finally learning the worst possible truth about the people he'd loved most. His phone rang again as he crossed the Ohio state line. A number he didn't recognize. "Jake Morrison?" "Yes." "This is Michelle Thompson. I think you found my family." Jake pulled over at a rest stop. "I'm sorry. I don't understand." "My parents and my little brother disappeared in 2003. They were driving to Florida for vacation. I saw the news report about the sinkhole, about all the families. The reporter mentioned a blue Honda with Pennsylvania plates." Jake's stomach knotted. "That might have been in the files, yes. I've been calling police departments for 15 years. They always told me my family probably had an accident somewhere or maybe started new lives. But I knew something was wrong. Families don't just disappear. No, Jake said. They don't? The FBI agent I spoke with, Agent Torres, he said you were the one who broke the case open, that you never stopped looking for your family. Jake didn't know what to say. He'd spent 20 years focused on his own loss, his own need for answers. He'd never really thought about all the other families who were also missing, also waiting. I just wanted to thank you, Michelle continued, and to ask, what happens now? To us, I mean, the families who are left. I don't know, Jake said honestly. I guess we figure it out as we go. After he hung up, Jake sat in his truck at the rest stop for almost an hour. Other travelers came and went, families with kids heading to vacation destinations, couples driving to visit relatives, ordinary people living ordinary lives. None of them knowing how easily it could all disappear, how a simple traffic stop on a lonely road could end everything. When Jake finally made it home to Columbus, the house felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he was different. For 20 years, this had been the place where he waited for answers. Now it was just a house where he happened to live. He walked through the rooms, looking at everything with new eyes. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the construction business paperwork spread across the kitchen table, the bedroom where he'd spent so many sleepless nights, wondering and hoping and imagining. All of it felt like someone else's life. His phone was ringing when he got out of the shower. Agent Torres. Jake, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We arrested 3 more people this morning. Who? 2 former deputies who worked under Hutchins and a state police detective who helped cover up some of the missing persons investigations. Brennan's cooperation is paying off. He's giving us names and details about the whole network. How many people were involved? At least 8 that we know of. Maybe more. This thing was bigger than we initially thought. They had people in multiple law enforcement agencies, insurance companies, even some county officials who helped falsify death certificates. Jake sank into his kitchen chair. Jesus? The good news is that Brennan's plea agreement requires him to provide complete cooperation. Every name, every detail, every bank account. We're going to prosecute everyone involved. What about the other families? The ones still being excavated? We've identified remains from 6 more families so far. Dr. Kim's team is working around the clock. Each identification means we can contact surviving relatives, give them closure like you got. After Torres hung up, Jake sat at his kitchen table and thought about Michelle Thompson's phone call, about all the other relatives who were probably waiting by their phones right now, hoping for news about their own missing loved ones. He thought about 20 years of searching alone, of carrying the weight of not knowing by himself. Maybe it didn't have to be that way for other people. Jake spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls, first to Detective Cross, then to Agent Torres, then to the FBI's Victim Services Coordinator. I want to help, he told each of them. The other families, the ones who are just finding out what happened to their loved ones. I want to be available to talk to them. That's very generous, the Victim Services Coordinator said. But are you sure you're ready for that? You just got confirmation about your own family. You might want to take some time to process that. I've had 20 years to process it, Jake said. These other families are just starting that journey. If my experience can help them somehow. Grief counselors usually recommend waiting at least. I'm not a grief counselor, Jake interrupted. I'm someone who's been exactly where they are, someone who understands what it's like to spend years wondering and hoping and getting nowhere. That's not something you learn in school. 2 days later, Jake was sitting in the FBI field office in Louisville, across from a woman named Patricia Henderson. Her husband and 2 teenage sons had disappeared during a camping trip in 1999. Their blue pickup truck was one of the vehicles found in the sinkhole. I never remarried, Patricia said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. Everyone said I should move on, that I was wasting my life waiting for dead people. But I couldn't. What if they came back and I wasn't there? Jake nodded. I understand. Do you? Really? Because everyone says they understand, but they don't. They don't know what it's like to wake up every morning hoping today's the day you'll get answers. I woke up like that for 20 years, Jake said. Every phone call, every knock on the door, every news report about unidentified remains. Part of me hoping it would be them, part of me terrified it would be them. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. Yes, exactly like that. They talked for 2 hours about the endless waiting, about the false leads and dead ends, about the way other people's sympathy eventually turned to impatience and then to avoidance, about the guilt of moving forward with life when your loved ones were frozen in time. When it was over, Patricia shook Jake's hand. Thank you for listening, for understanding, and for never giving up on your family. If you hadn't kept searching, someone else would have found that sinkhole eventually, Jake said. Maybe, but maybe not for another 20 years. My boys would have been 40 years old before anyone knew what happened to them. That evening, Jake called Detective Cross. I want to do this, he said. Work with the other families. Help them through this process. It's not going to be easy, Cross warned. Some of these cases go back 25 years. Some of the relatives have given up hope entirely. Others are angry at the system, at law enforcement, at everyone. I don't expect it to be easy. Nothing about this has been easy. And it won't bring your family back. Jake looked around his empty house at the photos and memories that were all he had left of the people he'd loved most. No, but maybe it can help make sure other families don't disappear as completely as mine did. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's something else you should know. The excavation at Hutchins' cabin is finished. They found remains from 14 families total. 47 people. 47, Jake repeated. 47 people who had relatives wondering what happened to them. Some of those relatives are still alive. Some of them died without ever knowing the truth. But because of what you did, because you never stopped looking, 47 families can finally come home. Jake hung up and walked out onto his front porch, the same porch where he'd watched his family drive away on that August morning in 1998. The street was quiet, lit by the same streetlights that had been there when he was 14. But everything was different now. Tomorrow he would start making calls to other relatives, other survivors. He would help them navigate the process of victim identification, funeral arrangements, and the long road toward whatever came after justice. It wouldn't bring his family back. Nothing could do that. But maybe in some small way it could make their deaths mean something beyond just another entry in Dale Hutchins' profit ledger. Maybe it could help ensure that no one else would have to spend 20 years searching for answers that should never have been hidden in the first place. Jake Morrison had spent half his life looking for his family. Now he was going to spend the rest of it helping other families find their way home. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in Riverside Cemetery in Columbus, watching 4 mahogany caskets being lowered into the ground. The funeral director had done his best, but after 20 years in Kentucky soil, there hadn't been much left to work with. The caskets were mostly symbolic, a way to give the Morrison family a proper burial at last. The service was small, Aunt Carol looking older and frailer than Jake remembered. A few neighbors who still lived on the street where he'd grown up. Detective Cross had driven up from Kentucky, along with Agent Torres and Dr. Sharon Kim, and standing near the back, almost hidden behind a large oak tree, was Mike Brennan. Jake hadn't expected Rick Brennan's son to show up. The last time he'd seen Mike was at high school graduation, back when they'd still been friends, before Jake learned that Mike's father had murdered his family for insurance money. After the graveside service ended and the small crowd dispersed, Mike approached Jake hesitantly. "I'm sorry," Mike said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "About your family. About what my father did." Jake studied his former friend's face. Mike looked haggard, like he hadn't been sleeping. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his chin, the kind of exhausted desperation that came from learning that everything you thought you knew about your life was a lie. "You didn't know," Jake said finally. "I should have known. I worked at the dealership summers during high school. remember? I saw him going through customer files, making phone calls at weird hours. I thought he was just being thorough. He fooled everyone. That was the point. Mike shook his head. You don't understand. I found something. After the FBI searched the dealership, after they arrested him, I went to clean out his office, and I found a lockbox hidden behind a false wall. Jake felt his pulse quicken. What kind of lockbox? Photos, hundreds of them, families posing with their new cars, including ... Mike's voice broke. Including your family, the day they bought the Honda. Jake remembered that day vividly. His dad had been so excited about the new car that he'd insisted on taking pictures. Mom and the girls standing next to the yellow Honda, all of them smiling, completely unaware they were posing for what would essentially be their death certificates. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked. Because there were other photos in that box, recent ones, families who bought cars from us in the last few years, after my father supposedly stopped. Mike looked around nervously, then pulled Jake aside, away from the lingering mourners. I think someone else has been continuing the operation. Jake felt the ground shift under his feet. What are you talking about? The lockbox had photos dated as recently as last month, and there were names, addresses, insurance information, the same kind of documentation my father kept on your family. Did you take this to the FBI? Mike shook his head. I was scared. If someone's still doing this, if they know I found the evidence. Who else works at the dealership? Just me and my Uncle Terry now. My father's younger brother. He took over the business when my dad was arrested. Jake remembered Terry Brennan, a quiet man who'd always seemed to live in his older brother's shadow. You think your uncle's involved? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe someone else is using our customer information. Mike pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I wrote down some of the names from the photos, families who bought cars in the last 6 months. Jake unfolded the paper and scanned the list. 8 names, all with local addresses, normal-looking family names that meant nothing to him. Have any of these families gone missing? Jake asked. That's just it. I don't know. I've been afraid to look into it, afraid of what I might find. Jake stared at the list, his mind racing. If someone was still running the same operation that had killed his family, if other people were in danger. We need to call Detective Cross, Jake said. Wait. Mike grabbed his arm. There's something else. One of the names on that list, the Taylor family. I saw them on the news last week. They never returned from a camping trip to West Virginia. Their car was found abandoned at a rest stop, but no sign of the family. Jake's blood ran cold. The same pattern. Family buys a car, goes on a trip, disappears without a trace. Just like his family 20 years ago. How long ago did they buy the car? 3 months. A blue minivan. Perfect for camping, my uncle told them. Jake pulled out his phone and called Detective Cross. She answered on the second ring. Jake? How did the funeral go? Someone's still doing it, Jake said without preamble. The same operation that killed my family. It's still happening. There was a long pause. What are you talking about? Jake explained about Mike's discovery, about the lockbox and the recent photos, and the Taylor family who disappeared after buying a car from Brennan's dealership. I'll be there tonight, Cross said. Don't do anything until I arrive, and make sure Mike doesn't go anywhere. If he's right about this, he could be in danger too. After Jake hung up, he looked at Mike, who was standing pale and shaking next to his family's fresh graves. My Uncle Terry, Mike said quietly. He was always around when I was growing up. Family barbecues, holidays, birthday parties. He played catch with me when my dad was busy with work. People aren't always who we think they are, Jake said, thinking of his own memories of Rick Brennan as the friendly neighborhood car dealer. If he's been killing families all this time, if he's still doing it? Mike's voice trailed off. Then we're going to stop him, just like we stopped your father. But even as Jake said the words, he felt a chill of fear. If Terry Brennan was continuing the operation, he would have learned from his brother's mistakes. he would be more careful, more paranoid, more dangerous. And if he suspected that Mike had found evidence against him. "You can't go home," Jake said suddenly. "If your uncle thinks you know something, you're not safe." "Where am I supposed to go?" Jake looked around the cemetery at the 4 fresh graves that represented 20 years of his own searching and suffering. His family was finally at rest, but other families were still in danger. "You're coming with me," Jake said. "We're going to sit down with Detective Cross and Agent Torres, and we're going to figure out how to catch this bastard before he kills anyone else." As they walked away from the graves, Jake couldn't help but think about the cruel irony of the situation. He'd spent 2 decades searching for his family's killers, and just when he thought justice had been served, the nightmare was starting all over again. But this time, he wasn't a 14-year-old boy left behind while his family drove toward their deaths. This time, he was a man who understood exactly how these predators operated, and this time he was going to be ready for them. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. That evening, Jake's house became an impromptu command center. Detective Cross had driven up from Kentucky with Agent Torres and a FBI technical specialist. Mike sat at Jake's kitchen table, looking shell-shocked as he went through everything he'd found in his father's hidden lockbox. "The documentation is extensive," Torres said, examining photocopies of the materials Mike had discovered. "Customer profiles, insurance information, travel itineraries. Someone's definitely continuing the operation." Detective Cross spread out a map of Ohio and Kentucky on the table. "If the Taylor family was taken 3 weeks ago, and their car was found abandoned at this rest stop." She marked a location with a red pin. "That's consistent with the same intercept pattern we saw with Jake's family." "What about the other names on the list?" Jake asked. Torres was already working his laptop, cross-referencing the names against missing persons databases. "The Yamamoto family, reported missing 4 days ago, bought a Honda Pilot from Brennan's dealership 6 weeks ago. They were driving to Yellowstone." "Jesus," Mike whispered. "How many people has my family killed?" "Your family didn't do this," Jake said firmly. "Your father did, your uncle is doing, you're helping us stop it." But even as he tried to reassure Mike, Jake felt the weight of all those fresh graves that were probably being dug somewhere in the Kentucky wilderness. While he'd been mourning his own family and helping other survivors find closure, Terry Brennan had been continuing the killing. "We need to set up surveillance on the dealership," Cross said, "and on Terry Brennan personally. If he's planning another intercept." Torres looked up from his laptop. "There's a problem with that approach. If Terry suspects we're on to him, he could run. Or worse, he could accelerate his timeline and kill the families he's already targeting." "What families?" Jake asked. Torres turned the laptop around so everyone could see the screen. It showed a customer database from Brennan's Auto Sales, with recent purchases highlighted. Based on the pattern Mike discovered, there are at least 3 families who've bought vehicles in the last month and are planning trips in the next few weeks. If Terry follows the same operational schedule as his brother... "They're all potential targets," Cross finished. Jake studied the names on the screen. The Wilson family, who'd bought a SUV for a trip to the Grand Canyon. The Rodriguez family, who'd purchased a minivan for a drive to Disney World. The Patterson family, the same Pattersons whose kitchen he'd been working on when this all started. "I know the Pattersons," Jake said. "I've been doing construction work for them. They mentioned they were planning a family vacation to Gatlinburg next week." Cross and Torres exchanged glances. "That fits the profile perfectly," Torres said. "Family trip through remote mountain areas, isolated roads where intercepts would be easy." "So what do we do?" Mike asked. "We can't just let him kill them." "We use them as bait," Cross said grimly. "We warn them what's happening, get their cooperation, and set a trap." Jake shook his head. "You want to put a family with kids in danger to catch this guy?" "We'll have full surveillance, backup units, the works. The family will never actually be at risk." "That's what you said about the original investigation 20 years ago," Jake pointed out. "Look how that turned out." Torres leaned forward. "Jake, I understand your concerns, But if we don't act now, Terry Brennan is going to keep killing families. How many more graves are you willing to accept while we try to build a perfect case?" Jake looked around the table at the faces staring back at him. Detective Cross, who'd been trying to solve cases like this for decades. Agent Torres, who'd seen too many crime scenes like the one at Hutchins' cabin. Mike Brennan, whose entire world had been shattered by learning what his family really was. And somewhere out there, Terry Brennan was probably looking at customer files and planning which family would disappear next. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jake asked. The plan was set for Tuesday morning. The Patterson family would leave for their Gatlinburg vacation as scheduled, but with FBI agents posing as family friends, following at a distance. Jake would be in the lead surveillance vehicle with Detective Cross, monitoring radio traffic and coordinating with the backup teams positioned along the route. Terry Brennan had taken the bait perfectly. Mike had casually mentioned to his uncle that the Pattersons were excited about their upcoming trip, that they'd specifically asked about the best route to avoid traffic. Terry had been very interested in those details, asking Mike to follow up with the customers to make sure they were satisfied with their purchase. Classic predator behavior, according to Agent Torres, gathering intelligence while maintaining plausible deniability. Jake sat in the passenger seat of Cross's unmarked sedan, watching the Patterson house through binoculars. At 9:15 a.m., the front door opened and the family emerged, parents and 2 teenage kids, loading suitcases into their new SUV, just like a normal family heading out on vacation. Except this family knew they were being hunted. "Unit 3 in position," came Torres's voice through the radio. Subject's vehicle spotted leaving the dealership, heading east on Route 33. Terry Brennan was following the same playbook his brother had used 20 years earlier. Wait for the target family to get on the road, then shadow them until they reached a predetermined intercept point where corrupt law enforcement would make the stop. But this time, the law enforcement wasn't corrupt. This time, they were ready. "Target family is mobile," Cross reported as the Patterson SUV pulled out of their driveway. "Beginning surveillance route." They followed at a careful distance as the Pattersons drove through Columbus and onto Highway 33 South. Jake's stomach churned as he recognized the same route his own family had taken in 1998. The same roads, the same traffic patterns, the same false sense of safety that came from traveling during daylight hours on well-maintained highways. "Unit 7, do you have eyes on the subject?" Cross asked. "Affirmative. Terry Brennan's pickup truck is maintaining position approximately 1 mile behind the target family. He's made 2 phone calls in the last 10 minutes. Jake felt his pulse quicken. "He's calling his contact, setting up the intercept." They drove for nearly an hour, the small convoy moving south through increasingly rural territory. Jake watched the landscape change from suburban sprawl to farmland to the forested hills of southern Ohio. This was the same scenery his family had seen on their last day alive. "All units, we've got movement," Torres announced. "Subject has pulled off at the Route 682 exit. He's stopped at a gas station." Cross grabbed her radio. "Is he refueling?" "Negative. He's in the parking lot, engine running, talking on his phone again." Jake understood what was happening. Terry was coordinating with whoever was going to make the traffic stop, making sure the timing was perfect. The target family needed to be in the right place at the right time for the intercept to work. "Unit 5, what's the status of our fake deputy?" Cross asked. "In position at mile marker 127 on Highway 31E patrol car, visible from the road, ready to make the stop when the target family arrives. Mile marker 127. Jake's blood ran cold. That was the exact same location where his family had been intercepted 20 years ago. Terry Brennan wasn't just continuing his brother's operation, he was using the identical playbook. "He's moving again," Torres reported. "Subject is back on Highway 33, resuming pursuit of target family." The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Jake watched the rolling Kentucky countryside slide past the windows, knowing that somewhere ahead of them, Terry Brennan thought he was driving toward another successful murder-for-profit operation. Instead, he was driving into the most sophisticated law enforcement trap in Kentucky State Police history. "Target family is approaching the intercept point," Cross announced. "All units, prepare for contact." Jake could see the Patterson SUV ahead of them, driving at a normal speed, the family inside probably tense, but trusting that the FBI agents surrounding them would keep them safe. "Subject vehicle is accelerating," Torres reported. "Terry Brennan is moving to overtake the target family." "What's he doing?" Jake asked. Cross frowned at her radio. "Unit 7, clarify the subject's position." Wait, something's wrong. The subject just passed the target family. He's not stopping at mile marker 127. He's continuing south." Jake felt ice form in his stomach. He knows. Somehow he knows it's a trap. "All units, abort intercept," Cross commanded. "Subject is aware of surveillance. Do not approach until we can reassess." But Terry Brennan wasn't running. As they crested a hill, Jake could see his pickup truck parked sideways across both lanes of the highway, blocking the road completely. The Patterson SUV was forced to stop, their vehicle trapped between Terry's truck and the surveillance cars following behind. "He's got them boxed in," Jake said. Terry Brennan got out of his truck, and Jake could see he was carrying something in his hands. Not a police badge or citation book. A shotgun. "All units, suspect is armed," Cross shouted into her radio. "Target family is in immediate danger." Jake was out of the sedan before Cross could stop him, running toward the blocked highway where Terry Brennan was approaching the Patterson family's SUV with murder in his eyes. "Terry!" Jake shouted. "It's over!" "You're surrounded." Brennan spun around, the shotgun swinging toward Jake. His face was twisted with rage and desperation, the look of a man who knew his 20-year killing spree was finally ending. "Jake Morrison," Terry snarled. "Rick always said you were too stupid to let sleeping dogs lie." "Your brother killed my family for money," Jake said, still walking forward despite the shotgun pointed at his chest. "How many more families have you murdered?" "Not enough, apparently." Terry's finger moved toward the trigger. "But I can still finish what Rick started." The shot rang out across the Kentucky hills, echoing off the surrounding ridges like thunder. But it wasn't Terry Brennan who fired. Agent Torres, positioned in the tree line 50 yards away, had put a sniper's bullet through Terry Brennan's chest before he could pull the trigger. Terry Brennan collapsed beside his pickup truck, the shotgun clattering onto the asphalt beside him. Dark blood spread across his flannel shirt as his eyes stared sightlessly at the cloudy sky. Jake stood over the body of the man who had continued his family's murder-for-profit operation, feeling strangely empty. No satisfaction, no sense of closure, just the hollow recognition that another chapter in a very long, very painful story had finally ended. Detective Cross approached, her weapon drawn but lowered. "You okay?" Jake looked back toward the Patterson family's SUV, where the parents and kids were climbing out on shaking legs, alive and safe, because this time the trap had worked. "Yeah," Jake said, "I think I am." 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the field behind his Columbus house, watching a construction crew pour the foundation for a new building. The sign posted at the construction entrance read, "Morrison Family Crisis Center, helping families find their way home." The center would provide support services for families of missing persons, counseling, investigative assistance, and coordination with law enforcement agencies. It would be funded by the book deal Jake had signed to tell his family's story, along with donations from other families who'd been reunited with their loved ones because of the Brennan investigation. Detective Cross walked up beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the donut shop across the street. "How's it feel?" she asked, handing him a cup. "Scary," Jake admitted. "I've spent my whole adult life focused on one thing, finding my family. Now I'm supposed to help other people do the same thing." You've been doing that for months already. Michelle Thompson, Patricia Henderson, all the other families you've worked with, you're a natural at it. Jake sipped his coffee and watched the workers spread concrete across the steel reinforcement mesh. In a few months, this would be a building where other people could come when their worlds fell apart, the way his had 20 years ago. I got a call yesterday, Jake said, from a woman in Oregon. Her teenage daughter disappeared 6 months ago. Local police think she's a runaway, but the mother believes something else happened. Are you going to help her? Already booked a flight for next week. Cross smiled. Your family would be proud of you, Jake. You've turned their tragedy into something that helps other people. Jake looked across the field toward the street where he'd grown up, where he'd watched his family drive away for the last time. The house where he'd spent 20 years waiting for answers that finally came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a drone survey of remote forest land. I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was staying home sick that day, Jake said. Missing the trip that killed them, but if I'd gone with them, then Terry Brennan would have killed you too, and none of those other families would ever have been found. I know, it's just... Jake struggled to find the words. I spent so long wishing I could have saved them. Now I realize maybe I was supposed to save other people instead. A truck pulled up to the construction site, and Jake recognized the driver immediately. Mike Brennan had been working construction for the past few months, learning the trade from Jake while trying to rebuild his life after learning what his family really was. How's he doing? Cross asked, watching Mike unload tools from his truck. Better. Still has nightmares about what his father and uncle did, but he's committed to making amends however he can. And the dealership? Closed permanently. Mike donated the property to the county for a memorial park. There's going to be a monument with the names of all the families his relatives killed. Cross finished her coffee and checked her watch. I should get back to Kentucky. We've got 3 more cases that might be connected to copycat operations in other states. More car dealerships? Car rentals this time. Same basic scheme. Identify targets with good insurance, intercept them during travel, collect the payouts. Greed is a remarkably consistent motivator. After Cross left, Jake walked through the construction site, imagining what the finished building would look like. Conference rooms where families could meet with investigators, a resource library with information about missing persons cases, offices for counselors and victim advocates, and in the main lobby, a memorial wall with photos of all the families who'd been murdered by the Brennan operation. His parents, David and Sarah Morrison, his sisters, Sarah and Jenny, the Hendersons, the Yamamoto family, Michelle Thompson's relatives, and dozens of others. All the people who'd been reduced to insurance claim numbers and profit margins, but who would be remembered here as human beings who'd been loved and missed and searched for by the families they'd left behind. Jake's phone rang as he was walking back to his truck. Unknown number. Morrison Family Crisis Center, he answered, though the building was still just a concrete foundation. Is this Jake Morrison? The voice was female, middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. Yes, ma'am. My name is Linda Martinez. My husband and son disappeared during a camping trip in 2001. I saw you on the news about how you found your family after 20 years. I was hoping maybe you could help me find mine. Jake looked back at the construction site, where workers were already starting to frame the walls of what would become a place where other people could come when they'd lost everything and didn't know where else to turn. Ma'am, Jake said, that's exactly what we're here for. 20 years after watching his family drive away, Jake Morrison had finally found his purpose. It wasn't about bringing the dead back to life. It was about making sure the living never had to stop looking for the people they loved. And in a strange way, that felt like the most fitting memorial his family could have asked for.